When desperate widow Margaret O'Sullivan falls asleep on a stranger's shoulder during a perilous stagecoach journey through 1867 Wyoming territory, she awakens to discover the rugged rancher Daniel Hayes has made a shocking decision that will change both their lives forever. But when accusations of her dead husband's crimes follow her to Daniel's ranch, will the truth she uncovers destroy her chance at redemption, or reveal that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships are forged in the dust between one life ending and another beginning? The stagecoach wheels screamed against rocks as bandits fired shots into the dawn sky behind them. Margaret O'Sullivan clutched her crying baby tighter, her heart hammering as the driver whipped the horses into a desperate gallop across the Wyoming Territory plains. November 1867 had brought early frost to the grasslands, and now it brought danger racing after their dust cloud. "Stay down, ma'am," shouted the bearded driver from his perch above. "Them's probably just trying to scare us, but ain't no sense taking chances." Margaret pressed herself against the hard wooden seat, baby James wailing in her arms. Through the bouncing window, she glimpsed 3 riders gaining ground, their horses' hooves throwing dirt clods high into the gray morning air. The $23 sewn into her dress felt like a fortune and a curse all at once. "Are they catching up?" called a deep voice from across the coach. Margaret had barely noticed the other passenger when she'd climbed aboard in Denver 2 hours before sunrise. Now she saw him clearly, a tall man with weathered hands and storm-colored eyes, leaning forward to peer through the rear window. His brown coat was well worn but clean, and something about his calm manner made her feel slightly less terrified. "Hard to tell with all this bouncing," the man said, settling back into his seat. "But our driver knows these roads better than most. We'll likely lose them once we hit the creek crossing up ahead." "How do you know that?" Margaret asked, surprised by her own boldness. The stranger smiled, and it changed his whole face. "Been traveling this route for 3 years now. Name's Daniel Hayes. I run cattle north of Cheyenne." "Margaret O'Sullivan." She shifted James to her other arm as the baby's cries began to quiet. I'm taking my son to start fresh in Cheyenne. My sister promised there'd be work." Daniel's eyes held no judgment, which was more kindness than she'd received from most folks back in Denver. The whispers had followed her everywhere after Patrick's death. "Poor Irish widow, husband died owing money. Baby probably born too soon if you catch my meaning." None of it true, but truth mattered less than gossip in polite society. The coach suddenly lurched left, throwing Margaret against the window. Daniel reached out to steady her, his strong hand gentle on her arm. "Creek crossing," he explained as the sound of splashing water rose from beneath them. "Drivers taking us through Willow Creek instead of the main bridge. Bandits won't follow through the water. Too easy to get trapped if a horse goes lame." Sure enough, when Margaret dared to look back, the pursuing riders had pulled up at the creek's edge. They sat watching as the stagecoach climbed the far bank, but made no move to follow. "You seem to know an awful lot about bandit behavior, Mr. Hayes," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice light despite her still racing heart. Daniel chuckled. "Wyoming Territory teaches you things whether you want to learn them or not. Been out here since '64, building my ranch from nothing. You learn to read danger signs, or you don't survive long enough to regret not learning." James had finally stopped crying, his tiny fist curled around the frayed blue ribbon Margaret had tied to her wrist, the last piece of Patrick's cavalry uniform she'd been able to keep when the creditors came calling. Everything else had been sold to pay debts she'd never known existed. "Your husband a soldier?" Daniel asked, noticing the ribbon. "Was. Second Lieutenant Patrick O'Sullivan. Killed at Fort Phil Kearny last December." The words came easier now, worn smooth by repetition to Army clerks and government officials. The pension they promised. Well, it turned out there were complications. Daniel's expression darkened. "Fetterman Massacre?" Margaret nodded, surprised he knew the battle's name. Most civilians had never heard of the remote Wyoming fort where 81 soldiers had died in a single afternoon. "Lost good friends there," Daniel said quietly. "Captain Frederick Brown was a decent man. Lieutenant Grumman too. They were following orders from fools who didn't understand what they were up against." Something in his tone made Margaret study his face more carefully. There was grief there, old and deep, the kind that came from personal loss rather than newspaper accounts. You knew them personally? Served with Brown in Colorado before I mustered out. Got a letter from him just 2 weeks before he died, talking about how the fort's commander kept sending out small patrols against Red Cloud's warriors. Said it was like feeding meat to wolves one piece at a time. Daniel's jaw tightened. Your husband was a brave man to serve under those conditions. The simple statement, delivered without pity or false comfort, meant more to Margaret than all the flowery condolences she'd received from Denver society ladies. Here was someone who understood what Patrick had faced, who honored his service without making her feel like a charity case. The coach had settled into a steadier rhythm now, following a well-worn track through rolling grassland dotted with cattle. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and painting the endless prairie in shades of gold and brown. For the first time since leaving Denver, Margaret allowed herself to believe she might actually reach Cheyenne safely. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, eager to keep the conversation away from her own troubles. "What's it like, building something from nothing in country like this?" Daniel's eyes lit up with the particular passion of a man discussing work he loved. "Started with nothing but a worn-out cavalry horse and $200 in discharge pay. First winter, I lived in a dugout carved into a hillside, survived on rabbit stew and determination. But the land, Margaret, you can't imagine how beautiful it is when the grass turns green in spring, or how the sky looks when there's nothing between you and the horizon but your own dreams." His enthusiasm was infectious, and Margaret found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "It sounds wonderful. Lonely, perhaps, but wonderful." "Lonely, yes," Daniel admitted. "That's the hardest part. A man can build buildings and raise cattle, but a house isn't the same as a home. Takes more than one person to make a place feel truly alive." Something in his tone made Margaret glance at him sharply, but his attention had turned to the window, watching his cattle graze in the distance. She wondered about his story, what had brought him to Wyoming, what dreams had sustained him through hard winters and lonely nights. Baby James stirred in her arms, making soft sounds that meant he'd be wanting milk soon. Margaret felt the familiar knot of worry tighten in her stomach. She had enough supplies for maybe 2 more days, and no idea what she'd find waiting in Cheyenne. Mary's letter had been encouraging but vague about details, and Margaret had learned not to count on promises from family members who'd never faced real hardship themselves. "How much farther to Cheyenne?" she asked. 6-7 hours if we don't hit any more trouble," Daniel replied. "You'll like the town. Growing fast with the railroad coming through. Lots of opportunities for someone willing to work hard." Margaret nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The truth was, she had no real skills beyond managing a household and keeping Patrick's accounts balanced. What kind of work could a widow with a baby hope to find in a frontier town? As if reading her thoughts, Daniel said gently, "Wyoming's the kind of place where people get judged more by what they can do than where they came from. Fresh starts are common out here. Most folks have stories they'd rather leave behind." The kindness in his voice nearly brought tears to Margaret's eyes. After months of suspicious looks and whispered comments in Denver, his simple acceptance felt like sunlight after a long winter. But as the morning wore on and the coach carried them deeper into Wyoming territory, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her troubles were far from over. The stagecoach jolted to a sudden stop, throwing Margaret forward against Daniel's knees. Baby James woke with a startled cry as voices erupted outside, the driver arguing with someone in rapid, angry tones. "What's happening?" Margaret whispered, her heart already racing again. Daniel was at the window in an instant, his body tense. "Road agent," he said grimly. "Just one. But he's got U.S. dead to rights with that rifle." Through the dusty glass, Margaret could see a lone horseman blocking their path. Unlike the morning's distant bandits, this man sat calm and ready, his weapon trained on the driver with practiced ease. He wore a black hat pulled low and a red bandana that covered most of his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," came a smooth voice from outside, "I do apologize for the inconvenience, but I'll be requiring your valuables today. Nothing personal, you understand. Just business." Margaret's hand flew instinctively to her bodice, where her precious $23 lay hidden. Without that money, she and James would be completely helpless in Cheyenne. Her mind raced through possibilities, all of them bad. "Stay calm," Daniel murmured. "Give him what he wants and he'll likely move on quick. These road agents don't like to linger. Too much chance of cavalry patrols." The coach door swung open and the bandit peered inside. Above the red bandana, Margaret could see intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her worn traveling dress, James's obvious hunger, Daniel's protective posture. "Well now," the bandit said, his voice carrying an educated accent that surprised Margaret. "A family traveling to make their fortune, I'd guess. Sorry to interrupt your journey, but times are hard all around." "We don't have much," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just enough to reach Cheyenne." The bandit's eyes softened slightly. "Ma'am, I surely hate to take from a lady with a baby, but I've got my own troubles to worry about. If you'd be so kind as to hand over your purse, I'll be on my way and you can continue your travels." Margaret's hands shook as she reached for her small bag, which contained only $3 in loose coins. Money she could afford to lose. The real cash remained hidden in her corset, but fear made her clumsy. As she lifted the purse, her sleeve caught on the coach door's handle, and she stumbled forward. Daniel caught her arm to steady her, but the motion brought her close enough to the bandit that she could see something that made her gasp. Pinned to the inside of his coat, barely visible beneath the dusty fabric, was a small brass button marked with the crossed sabers of the U.S. Cavalry. Their eyes met, and Margaret saw recognition flash across his face. He knew she'd seen the button. For a heartbeat, neither moved. "Ma'am," the bandit said quietly, his voice now carrying a note of urgency. "I believe you dropped something." He was looking pointedly at the ground near her feet. Following his gaze, Margaret saw a small piece of paper that must have fallen from her bag. She bent to retrieve it, and as she straightened, the bandit leaned close enough to whisper, "Fort Laramie, midnight, 3 days hence. Tell no one." Before Margaret could react, he'd taken her purse and stepped back, his voice returning to its earlier theatrical tone. "Much obliged, folks. You have a safe journey now." He swung back onto his horse and disappeared into the scrub brush as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving Margaret staring after him in shock. "Well," said the driver, climbing back onto his perch, "that's the politest road agent I ever did meet. Didn't even take everything, just asked for what he needed." Strange times we're living in. As the coach lurched back into motion, Daniel studied Margaret's pale face. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Are you all right?" Margaret clutched James closer, her mind spinning. The bandit's cavalry button, his whispered message, the strange gentleness with which he'd treated them. None of it made sense. But something about those brown eyes had seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen them before. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just shaken up, I suppose." Daniel didn't look convinced, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached into his own coat and pulled out a small flask. "This might help settle your nerves. It's just water, but it's cool and clean." Margaret accepted the flask gratefully, using the moment to compose herself. Whatever that strange encounter had meant, she couldn't afford to dwell on it now. She had to focus on reaching Cheyenne and finding the new life Mary had promised. "Mr. Hayes," she said after taking a sip, "you mentioned your ranch earlier. Do you ever get lonely out there? Just you and the cattle?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "Loneliness is part of the territory, I suppose, but there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. When I'm working with the cattle or watching the sunrise over my own land, I feel complete, I guess. Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "That sounds wonderful," Margaret said wistfully. "I can't remember the last time I felt like I belonged somewhere." "What about before? When your husband was alive?" Margaret's smile was sad. "Patrick was a good man, but army life. We were always moving, always temporary. I never had time to put down roots before it was time to pack up and leave again. And the other officers' wives." She trailed off, not wanting to sound bitter. "They didn't accept you?" "I wasn't born to their world," Margaret said simply. My father was a blacksmith in Boston. I could read and write and manage accounts, but I didn't know which fork to use at formal dinners or how to make proper small talk at tea parties. Patrick loved me for who I was, but his fellow officers saw me as proof he'd married beneath his station. Daniel's jaw tightened. Fools, the lot of them. A woman who can keep books and manage a household is worth 10 who can only gossip and pour tea. His fierce defense surprised Margaret and warmed her more than she cared to admit. You're kind to say so. I'm not being kind. I'm being honest. Out here, practical skills matter more than bloodlines. A woman who can think on her feet and work hard will always find her place. As if to prove his point, the coach suddenly tilted at a dangerous angle, one while sliding into a hidden rut. Margaret felt herself falling toward the window, James crying out in alarm, but Daniel's strong arm caught them both, pulling them safely against his solid chest. For a moment, they were pressed close together, close enough that Margaret could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to his clothes, close enough to see the small scar that marked his left temple, close enough to feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. Sorry, Daniel said, but he didn't immediately let go. Roads getting rougher as we climbed toward the mountains. Margaret found she didn't want him to let go either. It had been so long since she'd felt protected, since someone else had been strong enough to catch her when she fell. But propriety demanded she pull away, which she did with reluctance. Thank you, she said softly. The rest of the afternoon passed in companionable conversation as the landscape gradually changed around them. The endless grassland gave way to rolling hills dotted with pine trees, and the air grew cooler as they climbed toward the mountains that formed Cheyenne's backdrop. Daniel proved to be an excellent traveling companion, knowledgeable about the country they were crossing, but also genuinely interested in Margaret's own experiences and opinions. What kind of work are you hoping to find in Cheyenne? He asked as they shared the simple lunch Rosa had packed for him. My sister mentioned a position with the territorial governor's household, Margaret replied. Managing accounts, overseeing staff, that sort of thing. Mary says they need someone reliable who can handle responsibility. Daniel nodded approvingly. Sounds like it would suit you perfectly. Governor Campbell's got a good reputation, fair man, from what I hear. Treats his people well. But even as Margaret smiled and agreed, she felt a nagging worry she couldn't quite name. Mary's letter had been enthusiastic but vague on details, and Margaret had learned from hard experience not to count on promises until they became reality. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Margaret found herself wishing the journey could continue indefinitely. For these few hours, suspended between her shameful past and uncertain future, she had felt almost normal again, like a woman worthy of kind conversation and gentle treatment. But Cheyenne was only hours away now, and with it would come the test of whether her sister's promises would prove more reliable than her late husband's debts. What neither Margaret nor Daniel knew was that the mysterious bandit was already riding hard toward Cheyenne, carrying news that would change everything they thought they knew about Margaret's situation. Margaret's eyes flew open as the stagecoach lurched to a complete stop, but something was terribly wrong. Daniel's shoulder beneath her cheek felt too still, and the silence outside stretched like a held breath. She had fallen asleep against this kind stranger's arm somewhere after crossing Bear Creek, lulled by the steady rhythm of wheels and his gentle presence. But now panic shot through her as she realized they weren't moving at all. Daniel? She whispered, lifting her head to find his storm-gray eyes watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Baby James lay peacefully across both their laps, sleeping deeper than he had in weeks. We're not in Cheyenne, Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made her stomach drop. Driver got word at the last relay station. Sioux war parties spotted near Lodgepole Creek. Militaries closed the main road until they can send armed escorts. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered through the dusty window. Instead of Cheyenne's bustling streets and welcoming buildings, she saw only a handful of rough log structures scattered around a muddy yard. Men lounged against fence posts and wagon wheels, their eyes already tracking her movement through the glass with the hungry attention of wolves sizing up a lamb. Where are we? She asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Crossroads Station. About 40 miles short of where you need to be. Daniel's jaw worked as he studied the rough men outside. Station keeper says there's no proper place for a lady with a child. Just a bunkhouse full of drivers and drifters, and... He didn't finish, but Margaret understood perfectly. A woman alone with a baby, stranded among frontier men with no law closer than a day's ride. It wasn't just improper, it was dangerous. Some of those men outside looked like they hadn't seen soap or civilization in months. How long before the road opens? Margaret's voice came out smaller than she intended. Could be days. Maybe longer if the raids get worse. Daniel turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. Margaret, I've been thinking during the ride. I know this might sound forward, but... Before he could finish, the coach door swung open and the station keeper poked his grizzled head inside. A man whose missing teeth and whiskey-soured breath made Margaret instinctively pull James closer. Folks, you'll need to come inside and settle up for the night. Got beans and hardtack if you're hungry. And there's sleeping space in the back room. His eyes lingered on Margaret in a way that made her skin crawl, though the lady might find it a mite crowded with all the other travelers. Daniel's whole body went rigid. What other travelers? Oh, we got ourselves quite a collection tonight. 3 freight drivers heading north, couple of prospectors coming back from the Black Hills empty-handed and mean about it, and that fellow in the black hat who's been nursing whiskey since noon. The station keeper grinned, showing more gaps than teeth. Going to be a lively evening, I'd say. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. The man in the black hat, could it be the road agent from this morning? And if so, what did his whispered message about Fort Laramie mean? Actually, Daniel said, his voice taking on a tone of quiet authority. The lady and her child will be coming with me. My ranch is only 6 miles north of here. The station keeper's eyebrows shot up. That's so? Well, ain't that convenient? His leer made Margaret feel sick. You two know each other long? Long enough, Daniel replied smoothly, helping Margaret gather her few belongings. My foreman's wife will be happy to help with the baby, and we've got proper accommodations. As they prepared to leave the coach, Margaret caught Daniel's arm. Mr. Hayes, I can't impose on your hospitality like this. You barely know me and you barely know me, he finished. But sometimes in this country, you have to choose between strangers, and I'd rather trust my instincts about good people than leave you to the mercy of that crowd. His words were practical, but something in his eyes suggested deeper currents. Margaret found herself studying his face, the honest lines around his eyes, the firm set of his mouth, the way he held himself like a man accustomed to making hard decisions and living with them. Besides, Daniel added, lifting James from her arms with surprising gentleness, it's not charity. My place could use a woman's touch, and Rosa's been after me to find help with the household accounts. If you're willing to work, there's honest employment to be had. Margaret felt a flicker of hope pierce her fear. You're serious? Dead serious. I've seen how you handle yourself, how you think on your feet. And any woman who can keep a baby calm through what we've been through today has the kind of steady nerves I need in my operation. The station keeper was growing impatient, shifting from foot to foot as other passengers began emerging from coaches and freight wagons. Margaret could see the rough men gathering closer, their attention drawn by the sight of a young woman with a child. We need to decide now, Daniel said quietly. Either we go to my ranch, or I stay here tonight to make sure you're safe. But Margaret, I won't lie to you. This place isn't where you want to spend the night alone. Margaret looked at her sleeping son, then at Daniel's steady face, then at the crowd of increasingly interested men. Her practical mind calculated odds and options while her heart whispered that this man had already shown her more kindness than anyone had in months. Your ranch, she said firmly. If the offer's genuine, I accept. Daniel's smile was like sunrise. It's genuine. Rosa will be thrilled to have another woman around. And my foreman Jim's been telling me for months that the books need someone with a proper head for figures. As Daniel arranged for his wagon and horse from the station's corral, Margaret couldn't help but notice the black-hatted man watching them from the shadowy doorway of the station house. Even at a distance, something about his posture seemed familiar, and when he touched his hat brim in what might have been a salute, she felt that same strange recognition that had troubled her during the robbery. "Ready?" Daniel asked, returning with a solid-looking wagon and a pair of well-fed horses. "It's not fancy, but it'll get us home before full dark." As he helped her up onto the wagon seat, Margaret realized she was about to trust her life and her son's future to a man she'd known for less than a day. Everything sensible told her this was madness, but her instincts, the same instincts that had kept her alive through Patrick's death and the months of struggle that followed, told her Daniel Hayes was exactly what he appeared to be. A good man offering genuine help. "Tell me about your ranch," she said as they pulled away from Crossroads Station, leaving the rough crowd and the mysterious black-hatted man behind. "What's it really like, building a life in country this wild?" Daniel's face lit up with the particular enthusiasm of a man discussing work he loved. "Started with nothing but discharge pay and a broken-down cavalry horse. First winter, I lived in a hole carved into a hillside, survived on rabbit stew and stubbornness." "What made you stay?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. "Most men would have given up after a winter like that." "The land," Daniel said simply. "First morning I woke up in that dugout and climbed out to see the sunrise over grass that stretched to forever. I knew I was home. Not the home I'd been born to, but the home I was meant to build." His words stirred something deep in Margaret's chest, a longing she'd almost forgotten existed. The idea of belonging somewhere, of building something lasting instead of always moving from one temporary situation to another, seemed like a dream almost too precious to hope for. "And you've been alone out there all this time?" she asked. Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. "Alone, yes, but not lonely exactly. There's a difference. When you're working land that's yours, raising cattle that bear your brand, there's a satisfaction that fills up most of the empty spaces." He paused, then added more quietly, "But I won't lie. A house isn't the same as a home. Takes more than one person to make a place feel truly alive." Something in his tone made Margaret glance at him sharply, but his attention had turned to the track ahead, where a cluster of buildings was becoming visible in the gathering dusk. "There it is," Daniel said, and she could hear the pride in his voice. "The Hayes Ranch. Not much to look at yet, but it's mine, free and clear." Margaret caught her breath as they crested a low hill and Daniel's ranch spread out before them. It wasn't grand, but it was substantial. A 2-story log house with glass windows that caught the last light, a solid barn, and corrals that held sleek cattle. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm yellow light spilled from the windows, making the whole scene look like something from a storybook. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and meant it. As they approached the house, a woman emerged onto the wide porch, small and dark-haired, with the kind of face that smiled easily. Behind her came a silver-haired man with the bow-legged walk of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. "Rosa, Jim," Daniel called as he set the wagon brake. "I'd like you to meet Mrs. O'Sullivan and her son James. They'll be staying with us until the Cheyenne Road opens." Rosa's smile was immediate and genuine. "Madre de Dios, that baby is precious. Come, you must be exhausted. I have soup warming and clean beds ready." But as Margaret accepted Rosa's help down from the wagon, she caught the look that passed between the foreman and Daniel. A look that suggested there was more to this arrangement than simple hospitality, and that her arrival might be the answer to problems she didn't yet understand. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, you're bleeding." Rosa's sharp cry cut through the peaceful evening air as Margaret stumbled on the porch steps, nearly dropping baby James in her exhaustion. Dark stains were spreading across the back of her traveling dress, and her face had gone white as prairie snow. Daniel was beside her in an instant, his strong hands steadying her swaying form. "When did this start?" he demanded, his voice tight with concern as he guided her toward the house. I don't know," Margaret whispered, confusion clouding her green eyes. "I felt dizzy in the wagon, but I thought it was just tiredness. I haven't been eating much, and James needs so much." "Dios mío," Rosa exclaimed, taking charge with the swift efficiency of a woman who dealt with medical emergencies on an isolated ranch. "Jim, ride to town and fetch Dr. Morrison. Tell him it's urgent, new mother, possible complications. No! Margaret's voice cracked with panic. Please, no, doctor. I can't afford. The money I have has to last until I find work in Cheyenne. Daniel's jaw tightened as he swept her up in his arms, carrying her toward the house despite her weak protests. Money's not your concern right now. Getting you healthy is. As Rosa bustled ahead to prepare a bed, Margaret found herself studying Daniel's face in the lamplight streaming from the windows. Lines of worry creased his forehead, and something deeper than mere kindness burned in his storm-gray eyes. Something that looked almost like fear at the thought of losing her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly as he carried her up the front steps. "You don't even know me. For all you know, I could be running from the law, or lying about my husband, or—" "Are you?" Daniel asked simply, pausing at the threshold. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "No, but you have no way of knowing that." "I have instincts," Daniel replied, pushing through the door into a comfortable front room furnished with handmade furniture and colorful rugs. "Same instincts that kept me alive through 3 years of war and 4 years of building this place from nothing. And my instincts tell me you're exactly what you appear to be. A good woman dealt a bad hand, trying to make the best of it." Rosa had prepared the downstairs bedroom, normally reserved for guests, with clean sheets and hot water. As she and Daniel settled Margaret on the bed, baby James began to fuss, sensing his mother's distress. "Let me take him," Rosa offered, her experienced hands gentle as she lifted the infant. "I raised 5 of my own, plus half the orphaned calves on this ranch. He'll be safe while we tend to you." Margaret wanted to protest. She'd never let James out of her sight for more than a few minutes since Patrick's death, but weakness was overtaking her rapidly. The room seemed to spin slightly, and she could feel her strength ebbing like water from a cracked bucket. "The bleeding's getting worse," Daniel observed grimly, and Margaret realized he was right. What had started as light spotting was becoming something more serious. "Sometimes happens to new mothers," Rosa said, but her tone carried worry. "Especially when they've been under terrible stress, not eating right, worrying constantly. The body can only take so much." As Rosa worked to make Margaret comfortable, cleaning the wounds and applying pressure bandages, Daniel paced the small room like a caged wolf. Margaret watched him through half-closed eyes, wondering at the intensity of his concern for a woman he'd met just that morning. "There's something I need to tell you," Margaret said suddenly, her voice weak but determined. "About the road agent today, the one who robbed us." Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face her. "What about him?" "He had a cavalry button on his coat. Hidden, but I saw it when I stumbled. And he whispered something to me about meeting at Fort Laramie in 3 days." Daniel's expression went very still. "You're certain about the button?" "Positive. Crossed sabers, just like Patrick's uniform." Margaret tried to sit up but fell back against the pillows as dizziness washed over her. "There was something familiar about his eyes too, but I can't place where I might have seen them." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the bedroom window, they could see torches moving up the ranch road. Not the single rider they'd expected bringing the doctor, but several men riding hard. "That's not Dr. Morrison," Daniel said grimly, reaching for the rifle he kept mounted above the bedroom fireplace. "Rosa, take the baby and Mrs. O'Sullivan into the root cellar. Now." "No," Margaret said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice despite her weakness. "If this has something to do with that road agent's message, I need to hear it." The riders pulled up in the yard with a thunder of hooves and jingling spurs. Through the thin walls, Margaret could hear voices raised in urgent conversation, though she couldn't make out the words. Daniel moved to the window, peering carefully through the curtains. "It's Sheriff Morrison from Cheyenne," he said, his voice puzzled. "And that looks like— hell, that's Major Caldwell from Fort Russell. What's the army doing here?" Margaret felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. The army here looking for her. It could only mean one thing. Somehow, Patrick's debts and the accusations that had driven her from Denver had followed her even to this remote ranch. Heavy boots tramped across the porch, followed by authoritative knocking. Daniel looked back at Margaret, his face a mask of controlled concern. "Whatever this is about," he said quietly, "you're under my protection. Remember that." Before Margaret could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, Rosa was opening the front door and voices were filling the house. Official voices that carried the weight of law and military authority. "Evening, Rosa," came Sheriff Morrison's familiar drawl. "Sorry to disturb you folks so late, but we need to speak with Daniel Hayes about a guest he might be harboring." "What kind of guest?" Daniel's voice carried clearly from the front room, where he'd gone to meet the officials. "Woman by the name of Margaret O'Sullivan," Major Caldwell replied, his military bearing evident even in his speech. "Widow of 2nd Lieutenant Patrick O'Sullivan, lately deceased. There are some questions about irregularities in her late husband's accounts that need addressing." Margaret's world tilted sickeningly. Not only had they found her, but they were speaking about Patrick's accounts, the debts that had already cost her everything, now apparently grown into something even worse. "What kind of irregularities?" Daniel asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Missing regimental funds," the major replied bluntly. $200 withdrawn 3 days before Lieutenant O'Sullivan's death at Fort Phil Kearny. Money that was never accounted for, and a widow who disappeared from Denver before questions could be properly answered. Margaret bit back a gasp of shock. $200? Patrick had never had access to that kind of money. They'd been living on beans and hardtack half the time, saving every penny of his meager pay. Whatever these men thought they knew about her husband's accounts, they were wrong. But how could she prove it? Lying here weak and bleeding, with no allies except a rancher she'd met 12 hours ago. "Mrs. O'Sullivan is indeed here," Daniel said after a long pause. "But she's in no condition to travel tonight. She's been taken ill and needs medical attention." "I'm afraid that's not acceptable," Sheriff Morrison replied. "We have orders to bring her back to Denver for questioning. Tonight. And I'm afraid that's not happening." Daniel's voice had gone cold as winter wind. "The lady is under my protection, and she's not going anywhere until a doctor says she's fit to travel." The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. Margaret could picture the standoff in her mind. Daniel facing down both civil and military authority with nothing but his own stubborn integrity and the rifle he probably still held. "Hayes," Major Caldwell said finally, "I'd advise you not to interfere with official business. Harboring a fugitive is a serious charge. So is letting a sick woman die rather than wait 12 hours for proper medical attention," Daniel replied evenly. "Which is what you'd be doing if you drag her out of here tonight." Margaret closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that Daniel Hayes, this man she barely knew, was risking his own freedom to protect her from accusations she didn't even understand. But she also knew that his protection could only delay the inevitable. Whatever Patrick had supposedly done with that missing money, she was going to have to face those accusations eventually. The only question was whether she'd be strong enough to fight for the truth when that moment came. Blood splattered across the official documents as Margaret collapsed forward onto the kitchen table, her face chalk-white and her breathing shallow as Sheriff Morrison spread the damning evidence before her. The papers seemed to dance in the lamplight. Patrick's supposed signature on withdrawal slips, witness statements, account ledgers that painted her dead husband as a thief who'd stolen from his own regiment. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I need you to look at these carefully," Major Caldwell said, his voice gentler now that he could see her obvious distress. "Do you recognize your husband's handwriting on these withdrawal authorizations?" Margaret forced herself to focus despite the weakness that made her hands shake. Daniel stood behind her chair, one steadying hand on her shoulder, while Rosa held baby James near the warm stove. The contrast between the cozy kitchen scene and the brutal accusations created a surreal atmosphere that made everything feel like a terrible dream. "This isn't right," Margaret whispered, studying the first document. Patrick never had access to regimental funds. He was just a second lieutenant, the most junior officer in the company. According to Captain Burke's statement, Sheriff Morrison said, sliding another paper toward her, "Your husband was temporarily assigned to assist with payroll duties 3 days before the Fetterman fight. Burke says Lieutenant O'Sullivan claimed he needed the money for family expenses." Margaret's vision blurred as she read Burke's neat handwriting. each word another nail in Patrick's coffin. But something nagged at her, something wrong beyond the obvious impossibility of the accusations. "May I see Patrick's personnel file?" she asked suddenly. Major Caldwell frowned. "I'm not sure that's—" "Please," Margaret interrupted, her voice gaining strength from desperation. "If you're going to destroy my husband's reputation and drag me back to Denver in chains, at least let me see the complete record." The major reluctantly produced a thick folder. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it, scanning through reports and evaluations until she found what she was looking for. Patrick's duty assignments for his final month. "Here," she said, pointing to an entry dated December 18, 1866. Patrick was assigned to perimeter patrol duty that entire week. He wasn't anywhere near the payroll office, and according to this report from Lieutenant Grummond, he was commended for his vigilance during night watch duties. Daniel leaned over to study the document. Says here he was specifically assigned to watch for Indian sign along the wood road. Hard to be stealing money from the fort when you're camped 3 miles away. Sheriff Morrison and Major Caldwell exchanged glances. "Captain Burke's statement says," Morrison began. "Captain Burke's statement is a lie," Margaret said flatly, her fear transforming into righteous anger. "And I can prove it." She reached into her traveling bag with shaking hands, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in Patrick's careful script during their brief courtship and marriage. "These are Patrick's letters to me over 2 years, she said, spreading several on the table beside the official documents. "Anyone with eyes can see the handwriting is completely different." Daniel studied both sets of documents, his expression growing darker by the moment. "She's right. Look at the way the real Patrick forms his S. That distinctive loop at the bottom. The signature on these withdrawal slips doesn't have it." Major Caldwell was beginning to look uncomfortable. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, are you suggesting that Captain Burke forged these documents?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her physical weakness. "I'm stating it as fact. Someone forged my husband's signature to steal that money, then waited until he was safely dead to pin the blame on him." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and James's soft breathing. Margaret could see doubt creeping into the officials' faces as they compared the handwriting samples. "There's something else," she said, remembering the strange encounter on the stagecoach. "The road agent who robbed us today. He wore a cavalry button and whispered something about Fort Laramie. What if he knows something about this?" Sheriff Morrison sat back in his chair, suddenly looking older. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, if what you're saying is true, it means we've been chasing the wrong person entirely." "It means more than that," Daniel said grimly. "It means whoever really stole that money has been planning this for months, maybe longer. They waited until Lieutenant O'Sullivan was dead and his widow was vulnerable, then used the accusations to cover their tracks." Major Caldwell was studying Patrick's real letters with growing concern. "The handwriting discrepancy is undeniable. But if Captain Burke didn't steal the money, then who did? And why would he provide false testimony?" "Maybe because he was paid to," Rosa suggested quietly from her place by the stove. "Or maybe because he was threatened. Or maybe," she paused, then added in a voice heavy with suspicion, "maybe because he's the one who really took the money." The possibility hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Margaret felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. Burke's sudden interest in her finances after Patrick's death, his insistence that she leave Denver quickly before complications arose, his convenient transfer to California just as the investigation was heating up. "He told me Patrick died owing money to the Army," she said slowly. "Said there would be problems with the pension, that I should take what little I could get and disappear before they decided to prosecute me for his debts." "Classic misdirection," Daniel observed. "Make the victim feel guilty and grateful for small mercy, so they don't ask inconvenient questions." Sheriff Morrison was shuffling through the documents with a frown. If Burke was the thief, he'd need to be careful about the timing. Can't steal money and immediately disappear, that would raise suspicions. But if he could blame it on a dead officer and make the widow run away in shame, Then he'd have months to cover his tracks and arrange a comfortable transfer. Major Caldwell finished. It's diabolical, but it's clever. Margaret felt a mixture of vindication and exhaustion wash over her. After months of carrying the shame of Patrick's supposed crimes, the truth was finally emerging. But she was too weak to properly celebrate, and the bleeding hadn't stopped despite Rosa's careful ministrations. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wire Fort Russell and have them place Captain Burke under arrest," Major Caldwell said decisively. "And we owe you an apology, Mrs. O'Sullivan. A significant one. The Army will also need to restore your husband's good name and pay the pension benefits that were wrongfully withheld," Sheriff Morrison added. "With interest." Daniel's hand tightened protectively on Margaret's shoulder. "All of that can wait until she's had proper medical attention. Dr. Morrison should have been here an hour ago." As if summoned by his words, the sound of a horse and buggy came clattering into the yard. Through the window, they could see the elderly doctor climbing down from his rig, medical bag in hand. "About time," Rosa muttered, bustling to open the door. Dr. Morrison entered with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to medical emergencies on the frontier. One look at Margaret's pale face and blood-stained dress told him everything he needed to know. "Gentlemen, I'll need you to clear out while I examine the patient," he said firmly. "Mrs. Hayes, I'll need your assistance." As the men filed out of the kitchen, Margaret caught Daniel's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me when no one else would." Daniel's smile was warm despite the worry in his eyes. "Thank you for trusting me enough to stay. Now let the doctor fix you up so we can figure out what comes next." But as Margaret submitted to Dr. Morrison's examination, she couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Someone had gone to elaborate lengths to frame Patrick and destroy her life, and people that determined didn't usually give up just because their first plan had failed. The question was, what would they try next? Dr. Morrison's weathered hands moved with gentle precision as he examined Margaret by lamplight, his expression growing more concerned with each passing minute. The bleeding had worsened during the confrontation with the authorities, and dark circles under her eyes spoke of exhaustion that went bone deep. "How long since the baby was born?" he asked quietly, pressing a stethoscope to her chest. 7 weeks, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's been difficult. Not eating regularly, sleeping poorly, constant worry about money and running from accusations that weren't even true," Dr. Morrison finished grimly. He'd been listening from the hallway and heard enough to understand the situation. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, your body is trying to tell you something important. This bleeding, combined with your other symptoms, suggests you've been pushing yourself far beyond what any new mother should endure." Rosa leaned forward from her chair beside the bed. "What can we do to help her?" "Complete bed rest for at least a week, proper nutrition, and most importantly, an end to the constant stress that's been eating her alive." The doctor's stern gaze moved between Rosa and Margaret. "No travel, no difficult conversations, no worry about the future until her body has time to heal." From the front room came the low murmur of male voices as Daniel, Sheriff Morrison, and Major Caldwell discussed the implications of the forged documents. Margaret strained to hear their conversation, but Dr. Morrison's gentle but firm hand pressed her back against the pillows. "None of that concerns you right now," he said. "Your only job is to rest and recover. Let others handle the complicated business for a change." "But I need to," Margaret began weakly. "You need to trust that good people will do right by you," Rosa interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd raised 5 children through frontier hardships. "That man out there, Daniel, he's not going to let anyone hurt you or that baby. You've found yourself some powerful protection, Mija." Through the thin walls, Margaret could hear Daniel's voice rising slightly in what sounded like disagreement with the officials. She couldn't make out words, but his tone carried the kind of controlled anger that suggested he was fighting for something important. "What are they arguing about?" she asked. Dr. Morrison packed his instruments with deliberate calm. "From what I overheard, the sheriff wants to take you back to Denver immediately for a formal statement, despite your condition." Major Caldwell seems more reasonable, but he's under pressure from his superiors to wrap this case up quickly. And Daniel Hayes is telling them both that you're not going anywhere until I say you're fit to travel. The doctor's weathered face cracked into a slight smile. That young man's got backbone, I'll give him that. Not many would stand up to both civil and military authority for someone they barely know. Rosa began collecting the bloodied rags and soiled linens from Margaret's treatment. He's a good man, that one. Been alone too long, but good to his core. You could do worse than to trust his judgment. Something in Rosa's tone made Margaret study the older woman's face more carefully. You think there's more to his offer than just temporary shelter, don't you? Rosa's hands stilled in their work. I think Daniel Hayes has been waiting for something to come along that would make his house feel like a real home. And I think maybe you've been waiting for someone strong enough to stand with you when trouble comes calling. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of raised voices from the front room drew their attention. Daniel's voice cut through the others with sharp authority. I don't care what your orders say, Morrison. The woman nearly bled to death tonight, and you want to drag her back to Denver to sit in some government office answering questions? Use your head, man. Hayes, I understand your concern, came Sheriff Morrison's placating tone. But this is a federal matter now. We've got procedures to follow. Then follow them here, Daniel shot back. Send a court reporter, bring a federal marshal if you have to. But she's not leaving this ranch until she's strong enough to survive the journey. Major Caldwell's voice joined the discussion. Mr. Hayes, while I appreciate your protective instincts, we do have regulations about handling military justice matters. Your regulations be damned, Daniel replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that made smart men pay attention. I've seen what your military justice did to that woman. Drove her from her home based on lies and forged documents, let her think her dead husband was a thief, left her destitute with a baby to feed. You want her cooperation now? You'll get it when she's healthy enough to give it properly. The argument continued, but Margaret found herself focusing less on the words and more on the fierce protectiveness in Daniel's voice. No one had fought for her like this since Patrick's death. No one had considered her welfare more important than bureaucratic convenience or official procedure. He's falling in love with you, Rosa said quietly, apparently reading Margaret's thoughts. Probably doesn't even realize it himself yet. But a woman learns to recognize the signs. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks despite her weakness. That's impossible. We've known each other less than a day. Time doesn't always matter when it comes to the heart, Rosa replied pragmatically. Sometimes you just know when you've found your match. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before Margaret could answer, the front room door opened and Daniel appeared in the bedroom doorway, his face tight with controlled frustration. How is she, Doc? He asked, directing the question to Dr. Morrison but keeping his eyes on Margaret's pale face. She'll recover, but it's going to take time, the doctor replied. At least a week of complete rest, probably longer. And no stressful situations that might cause setbacks. Daniel's jaw tightened as he absorbed this information. The officials are insisting she needs to return to Denver for formal questioning about her husband's case. They're talking about sending an escort tomorrow. Absolutely not, Dr. Morrison said firmly. Moving her now could cause serious complications. I'll put that in writing if necessary. It might come to that, Daniel said grimly. They're under pressure from Washington to close this case quickly, especially if it involves misconduct by a cavalry officer. Margaret struggled to sit up despite her weakness. Daniel, I can't let you risk your ranch and your reputation fighting the government over me. If they insist I go back to Denver, then they'll have to go through me first, Daniel interrupted, his storm gray eyes blazing with determination. Margaret, I meant what I said about offering you partnership and protection. That protection doesn't end just because some officials want to convenience themselves at your expense. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond temporary shelter. Margaret found herself studying Daniel's face, the honest lines around his eyes, the firm set of his mouth, the way he carried himself like a man accustomed to making hard decisions and standing by them. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you risk so much for someone you barely know? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Because sometimes you meet someone and you just know they're worth fighting for, he said finally. And because I've been alone long enough to recognize what real partnership could look like when I see it. Rosa made a small sound of satisfaction, as if her earlier predictions were being confirmed. Dr. Morrison busied himself with repacking his medical bag, but Margaret could see approval in his weathered features. The officials are giving us until morning to make a decision, Daniel continued. But Margaret, I want you to know whatever you choose, you'll have my support. If you want to go back to Denver and clear your name officially, I'll make sure you get there safely and have proper representation. If you want to stay here until you're fully recovered, I'll deal with the consequences. Margaret closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the choice before her. Part of her wanted to rush back to Denver immediately, to confront Captain Burke and clear Patrick's name once and for all. But a larger part recognized the wisdom in Daniel's protective instincts. She was in no condition for a legal battle, and pushing herself too hard now could have serious consequences for both her and James. What do you think I should do? She asked, opening her eyes to meet Daniel's steady gaze. I think you should trust yourself, Daniel replied. You've survived everything that's been thrown at you so far by making smart decisions under pressure. This is just another decision, and I have faith you'll make the right one. As Margaret lay there weighing her options, she realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't facing her troubles alone. Whatever choice she made, she would have allies, people who cared about her welfare more than their own convenience. But she also knew that Captain Burke and whoever else might be involved in framing Patrick wouldn't simply give up because their first attempt had failed. If she stayed at the ranch to recover, would she be putting Daniel and his people in danger? And if she went back to Denver too soon, would she have the strength to fight for the truth when it mattered most? The decision would have to wait until morning. But Margaret had the unsettling feeling that whatever choice she made would set events in motion that none of them could fully control. A gunshot shattered the pre-dawn silence, followed by Rosa's terrified scream from the kitchen as armed men surrounded the ranch house in the gray light before sunrise. Margaret jolted awake in her bed, baby James crying in her arms, as boots thundered across the front porch and Daniel's voice roared from somewhere outside, filled with rage and defiance. Get away from her, you bastards! Came his shout, followed by the sharp crack of his rifle firing a warning shot into the air. Margaret struggled to sit up despite her weakness, her heart hammering as she tried to make sense of the chaos erupting around the peaceful ranch. Through her bedroom window, she could see at least 6 horsemen in the yard, their faces hidden by pulled-down hat brims and bandanas, but their intent was unmistakably hostile. Daniel! She called out, but her voice was too weak to carry over the shouting outside. Rosa burst through the bedroom door, her usually calm face white with fear. They came from 3 directions at once, she gasped. Surrounded the house before anyone could raise an alarm. Jim's in the barn with his shotgun, but they've got us outnumbered. Who are they? Margaret whispered, clutching James tighter as his cries grew more frantic. Don't know, but they're asking for you specifically. Rosa's hands shook as she checked the rifle mounted above Margaret's bedroom fireplace. The leader, big man with a scar across his cheek. He keeps shouting about taking you back to Denver, but these aren't lawmen. They're hired guns. The sound of splintering would came from the front of the house as someone kicked in the door. Heavy footsteps echoed through the rooms, accompanied by Daniel's furious voice as he was apparently dragged inside. Margaret O'Sullivan, bellowed a rough voice from the main room. We know you're in there, lady. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody else has to get hurt. Margaret tried to stand but immediately fell back against the pillows as dizziness washed over her. The events of the previous night had left her weaker than she'd realized, and her body simply refused to obey her desperate commands. I can't, she whispered to Rosa. I can't even walk, let alone run. Then we make our stand here, Rosa said grimly, positioning herself between Margaret and the door with the rifle ready. These walls are thick logs. Might give us some protection. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of furniture being overturned and searched. Margaret could hear Daniel arguing with someone, his voice tight with controlled fury. "She's sick, you fools. Can't you see she's in no condition to travel anywhere?" "Orders are orders," came the scarred man's gravelly reply. "Captain Burke wants her back in Denver. And what the captain wants, the captain gets." Margaret's blood ran cold at the mention of Burke's name. So her suspicions had been correct. The corrupt officer was behind this midnight raid, using hired guns to finish what legal intimidation had failed to accomplish. "Burke's been arrested," Daniel shot back. "Wire came through from Fort Russell an hour ago. Your boss is sitting in a military prison cell right now, so your orders don't mean anything." A moment of silence followed this revelation, broken by harsh laughter from the scarred man. "Shows what you know, rancher. Burke ain't in no prison cell. Man's got friends in high places, and sometimes evidence has a way of disappearing when the right palms get greased." Margaret felt her last hope crumble. If Burke had managed to escape justice and was now sending armed men after her, then nowhere would be safe. The corrupt captain clearly intended to silence her permanently rather than risk exposure of his crimes. "Rosa," she whispered urgently, "take James and get out through the window. These men won't hesitate to hurt innocents, and my son doesn't deserve to suffer for my troubles." "I'm not leaving you," Rosa replied fiercely. "And Daniel would never forgive me if I let anything happen to you while he was fighting to protect us all." The bedroom door suddenly exploded inward, revealing two armed men with hard faces and dangerous eyes. The leader, a giant of a man with the promise scar running from his left temple to his jaw, stepped into the room with his pistol drawn. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that made Margaret's skin crawl. "The famous Mrs. O'Sullivan. You've caused our employer a considerable amount of trouble, lady." "Whatever Burke is paying you," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "it's not worth committing murder for." The scarred man laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Murder? Who said anything about murder? Captain Burke just wants to have a private conversation with you about certain documents that need to disappear. Course, if you're not reasonable about cooperating." He didn't finish the threat, but his meaning was clear enough. Margaret glanced at Rosa, who was still gripping the rifle despite being hopelessly outnumbered, then at baby James, whose innocent face was red with crying. "Let me make you a counteroffer," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see the black-hatted road agent from yesterday's Stagecoach robbery step into the room, his own pistol drawn and pointed at the scarred man's back. Up close and without the bandana covering his face, Margaret could finally see his features clearly, and the recognition hit her like a physical blow. "Lieutenant Samuel Morrison," she breathed. "Patrick's friend from Fort Phil Kearny." The young officer nodded grimly, never taking his eyes off the hired guns. "Sorry about the robbery yesterday, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Had to maintain my cover until I could figure out who was behind the frame job against your husband." "You're supposed to be dead," Margaret whispered, remembering the casualty lists from the Fetterman massacre. "Your name was on the memorial service roster." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Samuel replied with bitter humor. "I was scouting ahead when the main force got ambushed. Came back to find my friends slaughtered and Captain Burke already spinning his story about what happened. When I started asking inconvenient questions about the missing payroll money, I had a convenient accident during a patrol. Took a bullet in the shoulder and got left for dead." The scarred man had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "I don't care who you are, soldier boy. You're outnumbered 6-1, and—" His words were cut off by the distinctive sound of rifles being cocked from multiple directions. Through the windows, Margaret could see Jim and several ranch hands taking positions around the house, their weapons trained on the remaining hired guns in the yard. "Actually," Daniel's voice came from behind Samuel, "I'd say the numbers have shifted considerably in our favor." Margaret felt tears of relief stream down her face as Daniel appeared in the doorway, his rifle ready and his storm-gray eyes blazing with protective fury. Somehow, he'd managed to escape his captors and rally his men for a counterattack. "Now then," Daniel continued, his voice deadly calm, "I believe you gentlemen were just leaving, and I'd strongly suggest you ride hard and fast. because I've already sent word to the real authorities about tonight's activities. The scarred man's eyes darted between Samuel's pistol and Daniel's rifle, calculating odds that were no longer in his favor. "This ain't over," he snarled. "Burke's got reach you can't imagine, and—" "Burke's finished," Samuel interrupted. "I've got documentary evidence of his theft, his frame job against Lieutenant O'Sullivan, and now his attempt to silence witnesses with hired guns. Whatever protection he thought he had won't survive the scandal that's about to break." As the defeated gunman filed out of the house under the watchful eyes of Daniel's ranch hands, Margaret finally allowed herself to believe that her long nightmare might actually be coming to an end. But she also realized that Daniel Hayes had risked everything. His ranch, his life, his future, to protect her from enemies he'd never made. The debt she owed him could never be repaid with mere gratitude. Samuel Morrison sat at Daniel's kitchen table 3 hours later, spreading documents across the scarred wood surface as the morning sun streamed through windows that still bore bullet holes from the pre-dawn gun battle. His face, no longer hidden behind the road agent's bandana, showed the premature lines of a man who'd seen too much death and betrayal for his 26 years. "Here's the proof you'll need," he said, pointing to a ledger bound in cracked leather. "Burke's personal accounts, showing deposits that match exactly with the missing regimental funds. He wasn't even smart enough to break up the amounts or wait a decent interval before spending the money." Margaret, propped up in a chair with pillows Rosa had insisted upon, studied the neat columns of figures with growing amazement. $200 deposited December 21, 1866, the same day Patrick supposedly withdrew it from the payroll office. Except Patrick was on patrol duty that day, 3 miles from the fort, Daniel added, reading over her shoulder. "And according to Lieutenant Grumman's report, he never left his post." Samuel nodded grimly. Burke counted on Patrick being killed in the massacre, which would make questioning him impossible. What he didn't count on was someone surviving who knew the truth about the duty assignments and could testify to Patrick's whereabouts. Baby James gurgled contentedly in Rosa's arms, seemingly oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around him. The morning light caught the golden threads in his fine hair, so much like Patrick's had been when she'd first met him in Boston 3 years ago. "Why didn't you come forward immediately after the battle?" Margaret asked Samuel. "Why let me suffer months of shame and poverty when you could have cleared Patrick's name right away?" Samuel's expression darkened with old anger. "Because Burke tried to have me killed when I started asking questions. Sent me on a routine patrol with 2 men he'd bribed, figuring they'd put a bullet in my back and claim it was an Indian attack. I only survived because I saw it coming and got lucky with my shooting." "So you've been hiding all this time?" Daniel asked. "Hiding and investigating. It took months to gather enough evidence to prove Burke's guilt, and I knew if I surfaced too early, he'd just arrange another accident for me." Samuel's jaw tightened. What I didn't expect was for him to frame Patrick for the theft. "By the time I learned what he'd done to you, Mrs. O'Sullivan, you'd already fled Denver and disappeared." Margaret felt a mixture of gratitude and frustration wash over her. "I've been running from lies while you've been gathering evidence to expose them. If only we'd found each other sooner." "We found each other when it mattered," Samuel replied simply. "And now we can make sure Burke faces justice for what he did to Patrick and to you." Through the kitchen window, they could see Sheriff Morrison and Major Caldwell riding up the lane, accompanied by 2 men in dark suits who had the unmistakable bearing of federal marshals. Word of the night's events had traveled fast, and the official response was swift and thorough. "That'll be the investigation team from Washington," Daniel observed, watching the approaching horses. "Samuel, are you ready to make your statement official?" "Been ready for months," Samuel replied, gathering his documents. "Time to let the truth see daylight." As the officials dismounted in the yard, Margaret found herself studying Daniel's profile in the morning light. The events of the past day and night had revealed depths of character she was still trying to understand. His willingness to stand against both legal authority and armed criminals to protect her. His calm competence under pressure. His gentle treatment of her son. "Daniel," she said quietly, "after all this is settled, after my name is cleared and Burke is brought to justice, what happens then?" Daniel turned from the window to meet her gaze, his storm-gray eyes serious. That depends on what you want to happen. You'll have your husband's pension restored, probably with significant compensation for what you've endured. You could go anywhere, start any kind of life you choose. And if I chose to stay here? Margaret asked, her heart beating faster at the implications of her own question. Daniel's expression softened into something that looked like hope mixed with wonder. Then I'd consider myself the luckiest man in Wyoming territory. This ranch could use a woman's touch, and James could use a father who'd love him like his own. Rosa made a small sound of satisfaction from her place by the stove. About time you two stopped dancing around what's been obvious since yesterday. Before Margaret could respond, Sheriff Morrison knocked on the door, interrupting the moment but not its significance. As Daniel went to greet the officials, Margaret realized that for the first time since Patrick's death, she was thinking about the future in terms of possibilities rather than mere survival. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Major Caldwell said as he entered the kitchen, I want to personally apologize for the Army's treatment of you in this matter. The evidence Lieutenant Morrison has provided makes it clear that you and your late husband were victims of a criminal conspiracy. What about Captain Burke? Margaret asked. Under arrest and being transported to Fort Leavenworth for court-martial, one of the federal marshals replied. His hired guns have been apprehended, and several other officers who were involved in covering up his crimes are being investigated. Samuel leaned forward. What about the men who died at Fort Phil Kearny? Will their families finally learn the truth about what really happened? A full investigation is being launched, Major Caldwell assured him. The official record will be corrected, and appropriate honors will be restored to those who were wrongly maligned. As the morning wore on, Margaret gave her formal statement while Samuel provided his evidence and Daniel testified about the previous night's attack. The wheels of justice, so long stalled by corruption and lies, were finally turning in the right direction. But for Margaret, the most important moment came when Dr. Morrison arrived to check on her condition and pronounced her well enough for light activity and cautious optimism about the future. Does that include making important life decisions? She asked with a slight smile. Depends on what kind of decisions you're considering, the doctor replied with a knowing look toward Daniel. But I'd say your judgment has been pretty sound so far. No reason to doubt it now. As the officials prepared to leave with their statements and evidence, Margaret made her choice. She'd spent months running from a past that wasn't even real. Now it was time to run toward a future that could be everything she'd ever hoped for. Daniel, she said as the last horse disappeared down the lane, about that partnership you mentioned. His smile was like sunrise over the prairie, wide and warm and full of promise. I'm still interested if you are. I am, Margaret said simply, then added with growing confidence. We are. Looking down at James, who was reaching toward Daniel with obvious trust and affection, Margaret realized that sometimes the most important journeys weren't the ones that took you away from home, but the ones that finally brought you to where you belonged. The dust had settled, and the stars were beginning to show through the clearing sky. Margaret's wedding dress caught fire from the kitchen stove as she tried to iron out the wrinkles 3 weeks later, sending Rosa into a panic and filling the ranch house with smoke on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her new life. The simple cream-colored dress, the only decent gown she owned, now bore a brown scorch mark across the hem, and tears streamed down her face as she stared at the ruined fabric. Dios mío, Rosa exclaimed, beating out the smoldering cloth with a wet towel. It's not so bad, Mija. We can fix this. No, we can't, Margaret sobbed, sinking into a kitchen chair with baby James fussing in her arms. Look at it. I can't get married in a burn dress. What will people think? What will Daniel think? Through the window, she could see wagons arriving in the yard as neighbors came from miles around for the wedding celebration. The simple ceremony had grown into something much larger than either she or Daniel had planned, with families eager to welcome the new Mrs. Hayes into their close-knit community. Margaret, what's wrong? Daniel's voice came from the doorway, followed by his sharp intake of breath as he saw the damaged dress. What happened? I ruined everything, Margaret whispered, not looking up from the scorched fabric. The dress? The day? Probably your reputation for marrying a clumsy woman who can't even iron properly. Daniel crossed the room in 3 quick strides, kneeling beside her chair and taking her free hand in both of his. "Hey, look at me," he said gently. "This dress doesn't matter. What matters is that in an hour, you're going to become my wife and James is going to become my son. A little scorch mark can't change that." "But the neighbors," Margaret protested weakly. They'll think you're human," Daniel interrupted with a smile. "And anyone who'd judge a woman for having an accident on her wedding day isn't worth worrying about." Rosa was examining the dress with the critical eye of someone who'd raised 5 children and mended countless garments. "You know what? I have an idea." She disappeared into her bedroom and returned moments later with a beautiful shawl of deep blue wool embroidered with silver thread. "This was my mother's. She wore it to her wedding in Mexico, and I wore it to mine. The blue will hide the scorch mark, and the embroidery will make you look like a queen." Margaret touched the soft fabric with reverent fingers. "Rosa, I couldn't. It's too precious." "Nonsense. What good is a family heirloom if it sits in a trunk instead of being worn by family?" Rosa's eyes twinkled as she wrapped the shawl around Margaret's shoulders. "And you are family now, whether the wedding has happened yet or not." The warmth of the gesture, and the acceptance it represented, made fresh tears spring to Margaret's eyes. But these were different tears, born of gratitude rather than frustration. "There," Daniel said, studying the effect of the shawl. "You look beautiful. More beautiful than any dress could make you." A knock at the front door interrupted the moment, followed by the sound of Samuel Morrison's voice calling out a greeting. He'd stayed at the ranch for the past 3 weeks, helping with the final details of Burke's prosecution and serving as the key witness in the court-martial proceedings. "The circuit judge just arrived," Samuel announced as he entered the kitchen. "And Margaret, before you ask, yes, Burke's conviction was upheld by the military tribunal. He'll be spending the next 10 years in federal prison, and the other officers involved in the cover-up are facing their own consequences." Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "So it's really over? The accusations, the investigation, all of it?" "Completely over," Samuel confirmed. "Your husband's name has been officially cleared, and the Army has issued a formal apology. There's also a substantial settlement being prepared to compensate you for your losses." Daniel squeezed her hand. "See? Everything's working out exactly as it should." Through the window, Margaret could see more people arriving. Families with children, elderly couples, young men in their best clothes. The sight of so many people coming to celebrate her marriage to Daniel still felt like a dream she might wake up from at any moment. "I should go get ready," Daniel said, standing and straightening his vest. "Can't have the groom looking less prepared than the bride." As he headed toward his room to change into his wedding suit, Margaret heard him humming softly, a tune she recognized as the Irish melody Patrick used to sing when he was particularly happy. The fact that Daniel would unconsciously choose that song seemed like a blessing from beyond, a sign that her first husband approved of her choice to love again. "Rosa," Margaret said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, Mija. Am I doing the right thing? Marrying Daniel so soon after everything? People might say I'm rushing into this, or that I'm just looking for security instead of love." Rosa sat down across from her, her wise eyes kind but serious. "Let me tell you something about love, Margaret. There's the kind of love that grows slowly over years of shared experience, and there's the kind of love that hits you like lightning when you meet the right person at the right time. Both kinds are real, and both kinds can last a lifetime. Which kind do you think this is?" "I think," Rosa said with a gentle smile, "that you and Daniel have both kinds. You've been through more together in 3 weeks than most couples experience in 3 years. You've seen each other under pressure, in danger, making hard decisions. And what you've found is that you're stronger together than either of you could be alone." Margaret considered this as she adjusted the borrowed shawl around her shoulders. It was true that the circumstances of their meeting had been extraordinary, but that didn't make the feelings any less real. "Besides," Rosa added with a mischievous glint in her eye, "I've seen the way that man looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. and the way you light up when he walks into a room. If that's not love, then I don't know what is." Another knock at the door brought news that the judge was ready to begin the ceremony. Margaret's heart started beating faster as the reality of what was about to happen sank in. In a few minutes, she would no longer be Margaret O'Sullivan, the widow running from false accusations. She would be Margaret Hayes, wife to a good man and mother to a son who would grow up knowing his father's true worth. "One more thing," Samuel said as they prepared to leave the kitchen. "I have something that belongs to you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden box, which he placed gently in Margaret's hands. "Patrick asked me to give this to you if anything happened to him. I've been carrying it ever since the massacre, waiting for the right moment." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a simple gold locket. Not expensive, but polished to a bright shine. When she opened it, she found a tiny photograph of herself on one side and a lock of baby James's hair on the other. "He had this made in Denver the last time he was on leave," Samuel explained. "Said he wanted to carry his family close to his heart, even when duty took him far from home." The locket was Patrick's final gift to her. Not just the jewelry itself, but the message it represented. He had loved her and James completely, and he would want them to be happy and safe, even if that meant finding love with someone else. "Help me put it on?" Margaret asked Daniel as he returned to the kitchen in his wedding suit. Daniel's hands were gentle as he fastened the locket around her neck, and Margaret felt the perfect rightness of the moment. The past and the future were coming together in a way that honored both her first love and her new beginning. "Are you ready, Mrs. Hayes?" Daniel asked with a smile. "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice steady and sure. "I'm ready." As they walked toward the front door where their guests waited, Margaret realized that this was what happiness felt like. Not the absence of sorrow or struggle, but the presence of love strong enough to overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. The wedding ceremony lasted only 10 minutes, but Margaret would remember every second for the rest of her life as she stood beneath the towering cottonwood tree in Daniel's front yard, surrounded by neighbors who had become family and speaking vows that would bind her to a man she'd known for less than a month but trusted with her entire future. "Do you, Margaret Elizabeth O'Sullivan, take Daniel James Hayes to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Judge Whitman's voice carried clearly across the gathering of 50 or so people who had come to witness the ceremony. Children sat on blankets at their parents' feet, while the adults stood in a loose circle around the couple, their faces reflecting genuine joy at the union taking place before them. "I do," Margaret said, her voice strong and clear despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. Daniel's eyes never left her face as he repeated his own vows, his storm-gray gaze holding promises that went far beyond the traditional words. When he spoke about protecting and cherishing her, Margaret knew he meant it with every fiber of his being. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Whitman declared. "Daniel, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle but firm, a seal on the promises they just made and a preview of the life they would build together. When they separated, the gathered crowd erupted in cheers and applause, with someone playing a fiddle and children running between the adults with whoops of excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rosa called out over the noise, "dinner is served. Come fill your plates and help us celebrate the new Mr. and Mrs. Hayes." Tables had been set up in the yard, loaded with food that the neighboring families had brought to share. There was roasted beef from the Murphy Ranch, fresh bread from the Andersons, vegetables from the Johnsons' garden, and 3 different kinds of pie from the church ladies. The abundance was overwhelming to Margaret, who had grown used to making do with very little. "This is incredible," she told Daniel as they filled their plates. "I can't believe all these people came just for us." "Frontier communities are like that," Daniel replied, nodding toward the Miller family, who had traveled 20 miles to attend. "When someone gets married, it's cause for celebration for everyone. Marriages mean stability, new families, the community growing stronger." As they ate and mingled with their guests, Margaret found herself marveling at how different her life had become in such a short time. 3 weeks ago, she had been a desperate widow with a sick baby, fleeing from accusations she couldn't defend against. Now she was a ranch wife with a secure future and a man who loved her completely. "Mrs. Hayes," said elderly Mrs. Patterson, approaching with a knowing smile, "I wanted to give you this." She pressed a small wrapped package into Margaret's hands. "Open it later when you have a quiet moment. It's something every new bride should have." Similar gifts appeared throughout the afternoon as neighbors offered their congratulations and practical advice. Margaret received dish towels, preserving jars, packets of seeds for next year's garden, and even a rocking chair that Mr. Johnson had been working on for weeks after hearing about the wedding. "People are so generous," Margaret murmured to Rosa as they watched the children playing games in the yard, while their parents talked and laughed around the tables. "They're investing in the future," Rosa replied wisely. "Every successful marriage, every healthy child, every prosperous ranch makes the whole community stronger. Your happiness is their happiness." As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the party began to wind down. Families with young children packed up their wagons first, followed by the elderly couples who had long rides home. Soon only the closest neighbors remained, helping to clean up and sharing final congratulations. "Thank you," Margaret said to Judge Whitman as he prepared to leave, "for everything, for performing the ceremony on short notice, for believing in us when others might have been skeptical about such a quick courtship." "Mrs. Hayes," the judge replied with a smile, "I've been performing marriages for 15 years, and I've learned to recognize the real thing when I see it. You and Daniel have something special, the kind of partnership that will last through whatever challenges come your way." As the last wagon disappeared down the lane, Margaret found herself alone with her new husband in the gathering twilight. Baby James was sleeping peacefully in Rosa's arms, and the older woman had tactfully retreated to her own quarters, leaving the newlyweds to enjoy their first evening as a married couple. "So," Daniel said, wrapping his arms around Margaret from behind as they stood on the porch watching the stars appear, "how does it feel to be Mrs. Hayes?" "It feels like coming home," Margaret replied, leaning back against his solid chest. "Like I've finally found where I belong." "And James? How do you think he'll take to having a new father?" Margaret turned in Daniel's arms to face him. "I think he'll love having a father who chose to be his father, rather than just accepting it as an obligation. You've already shown him more attention and care than most men show their own children." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, the gentle rustle of wind through the cottonwood leaves, the occasional call of a night bird. It was a peaceful symphony that spoke of safety and belonging. "Daniel," Margaret said quietly, "I want you to know that I don't take this lightly. This marriage, your protection, your love. I know how precious it all is, and I won't waste it." "I know you won't," Daniel replied, his voice warm with affection. "But Margaret, I want you to understand something too. This isn't charity or obligation on my part. I'm not rescuing you out of pity or duty. I'm marrying you because I love you, because I want to spend my life with you, because you make me complete in ways I didn't even know I was incomplete." His words washed over her like a blessing, erasing the last traces of doubt or insecurity she'd been carrying. She was loved, truly, completely, without reservation or condition. "I love you too," she said simply. "I didn't think I could feel this way again after losing Patrick, but you've shown me that the heart has room for more than one great love." As they headed inside to begin their new life together, Margaret caught sight of the locket Patrick had given her, now hanging beside the wedding ring Daniel had placed on her finger. The two pieces of jewelry didn't compete with each other. Instead, they seemed to complement one another, representing the journey that had brought her to this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning to manage a ranch household, helping Daniel with his business decisions, raising James in this wild but wonderful country. But tonight was for celebration, for gratitude, for the simple joy of being exactly where she belonged. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," Daniel said as he carried her across the threshold. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," Margaret replied with a smile that lit up her entire face. "It's good to be home." As the door closed behind them, The Wyoming stars shone down on the ranch house where two broken hearts had found healing in each other's love, and where a new family was beginning its story beneath the vast prairie sky.